In his book, The Anatomy of Story, John Truby argues that characters should be defined by how they compare and contrast with each other in what he calls a character web. Just as people in real life don't exist in a vacuum, neither do fictional characters. They exist in a world in which they must interact with other characters. How and why these characters interact gives context to their actions, and this is important because, as Sid Field said in his book Screenplay, action is character. Characters are defined not by what they say or by what we're told about them, but by what they do. A clever character does clever things. A cowardly character does cowardly things. A generous character does generous things. Whatever a character does, that is what makes them who they are. And what a character does is informed by their motivations, which are at least in part informed by their relationships with other characters. One character who is in love with another character will do things to try to earn that character's affection. One character who wants revenge on another will do things to hurt that character. One character who is afraid of another will take steps to avoid that character. Characters make decisions and perform actions based on how they are affected by other characters or how they want to affect other characters. Since action is character, if character actions are defined by the relationships, then characters themselves are defined by their relationships. For this reason, when writing a character, a writer needs to consider not just the personality traits, desires, fears, or any of the other obvious things. They need to consider how that character relates to other characters who also need to have their own personality traits, desires, fears, and so on. Let's imagine we have a character who's mean and antisocial. The circumstances of the story force them against their will to partner up with another character who's friendly and tries to get along with everybody. Now let's imagine these two characters have to extract information from a third character who has something to hide. The mean character uses threats and the friendly character uses flattery. By showing the way these two different characters behave differently in the same situation, we see a contrast between them which highlights the traits of both. The mean character does mean things, and the friendly character does friendly things. These actions define these characters. And whichever tactic is successful reveals the strengths of that character while also showing the weaknesses of the other character whose tactic failed, and thus we see how these characters need to grow. If the mean character is successful in extracting information, the friendly character might realize they need to be more assertive. Conversely, if the friendly character succeeds, then the mean character might realize there's some truth to the saying that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. In either case, the trajectory for a character arc is defined. Through their continued interactions and their back and forth one-upping of each other, these two characters are on paths toward realizing and overcoming their personal flaws, and they will grow and become better versions of themselves, which is something they will need to do to achieve their goals by the end of the story. Whether or not the characters in any story realize it, they need each other. Whether they're helping each other or opposing each other, their interactions determine how they change and grow. The hero of an adventure story cannot become a hero without an opponent to fight, and the hero of a romantic comedy cannot fall in love without somebody to fall in love with. Interactions between characters are necessary for growth, and whether their growth is positive or negative, it is necessary to make any character compelling. So how do you make characters interact in a way that's believable? John Truby once said in an interview with Film Courage that story writing is the most difficult craft in the world. He might not be wrong, because a writer must have at least some understanding of a very broad variety of topics, not the least of which are philosophy, psychology, and ethics, because these are the bricks with which one constructs a character. Understanding how different people with different philosophies, psychologies, and ethical opinions might see the world differently from each other and want different things, or the same thing but for different reasons, is the key to creating characters with values that contrast with each other, which is necessary for creating conflict and therefore drama. A rich person doesn't see the world the same way as a poor person, and a little girl doesn't see the world the same way as an old man. A writer needs to be able to put themselves in the shoes of different people and imagine how the world looks to them as filtered through their lived experiences. This can be extremely difficult, which is why many writers stick to writing characters who are the same race, sex, and socioeconomic class as themselves, and any characters with opinions different from their own are portrayed as invariably wrong or even immoral. In doing so, these authors impose limitations on themselves. You cannot write a believable character if you insist on portraying them as good and enlightened just because they agree with you, or evil and ignorant just because they disagree. As with real people in real life, characters have their own reasons for thinking the way they do, and while there do exist people who do things they know to be wrong for their own personal gain, most people tend to see themselves as the good guys, and they come up with ways to justify themselves even if their justifications don't make sense to other people. The people who oppose the hero aren't always bad people. Sometimes they just want what's best for them, or they believe the hero is in the wrong somehow. Sometimes they're right, and the hero is the one who needs to realize they've been wrong. But many writers actually have the opposite problem. They try to shoehorn in characters of different sex, ethnic, cultural, and socioeconomic groups for the sake of representation. When they do this, they often make the mistake of thinking a character simply being a minority is enough to make them interesting. To make matters worse, they're often unwilling to portray such a character in a negative light, either for their own ideological reasons or for fear of being called prejudiced. So they end up creating a character who's unrealistically idealized, with inexplicable knowledge, competence, or skill, and no real psychological or moral flaws or weaknesses, and portraying them as invariably in the right in all situations, while any other characters who oppose them are invariably portrayed as wrong or even evil for doing so. When this happens, you end up with the dreaded Mary Sue, but that's another topic. An understanding of the way different people think and arrive at their own conclusions is necessary to create well-rounded characters who interact with each other believably. Let's say we have a character who's an abusive father. Why is he abusive? Maybe he was abused as a child himself and doesn't know how to raise a child without violence. Maybe he's a combat veteran with PTSD and his episodes manifest as uncontrollable anger. Maybe he's an alcoholic who drinks to numb some emotional pain, but he becomes violent when he's drunk. While it's difficult to sympathize with a character who abuses children, it's important to realize that such a character acts the way they do for a reason. And it doesn't have to be a good reason that anyone would necessarily see as an excuse. It just has to be a comprehensible reason that explains their behavior. Whether or not this character is aware of the way they hurt others, whether he feels remorse for it, whether any other characters forgive him or hold it against him, fear him or try to fight him, or are even aware of his abusiveness, and so on, these things paint the way he interacts with other characters, and the way other characters interact with him. This character makes decisions based on how he affects or is affected by others, and other characters make decisions based on how he affects them or how they want to affect him. Every character who interacts with this character will act differently based on their experiences with him, and he will act differently based on his experiences with them. And it's through these interactions that this character is revealed. But for his character to be revealed, he needs to have a character in the first place. This means there needs to be a how and a why to his actions. Depending on the role this character plays in the story, he doesn't need to be sympathetic. The audience just needs to understand what he is as a character, and what he is defined by his actions, which are revealed through his interactions with other characters. So what would the character web for such a character be? If this character is an abusive father, then it stands to reason that he has one or more kids who are victims of his abuse. If there are more than one kid, how do these kids interact with each other? Does the older one try to protect the younger one? Do they hide or flee from him? What about their mother? Is she also a victim, or does she enable this abuse? How does she interact with the kids? Does she try to protect them, or is she participating in abusing them? Does the abusive father have any friends? Are they aware of the way he treats his family? If so, do they try to stop him, or do they side with him, or do they just treat it as none of their business? How do they interact with the mother and kids? Do the kids have friends? Do they know about the abuse? What do they know about it, if anything? And who is the main character of this story? Whose perspective will the audience be seeing? Each of these characters has their own perception of the situation, and they each have their own motivations for acting the way they do. Some try to help each other, others try to hinder each other, but it's through the way they act toward each other that their characters are revealed. So it should be clear that no character exists independently of other characters, or if they do, such characters are rare and extremely difficult to write well.